I think as we are assessing 2 years of the Modi Sarkar, there's so much focus on the economy, but there's not enough focus on, let's say, social welfare, and that clearly is an area where I think we need to spend some give some attention. Now, I think it's very clear from what we've heard this morning and also probably yesterday, that there is a very distinct and a very recognizable change in the general tenor of public discourse. That is to say, unlike in the past, it is much more informed by divisive, or if you like, a divisive and communal rather than a liberal secular ethos. And I need not list some of the things that have happened in the past 2 or 3 years, except to flag up the very striking instances which in a certain sense signal the politics of division and polarization that we're talking about. Most importantly, of course, the lynching of Mohammad Ikhlaq in Dadri, the stoking of divisive issues like the ban beef, and of course more recently the Bharat Mata Ki Jai controversy and the insistence that if you don't say Bharat Mata Ki Jai, you would face exile. And before that, of course, most significantly, the killing of rationalists. These are really striking attempts to polarize and divide society. And of course, the most recent incident about which you've heard this morning is the bogus sedition case against a bunch of JNU students, which was used to launch a nationwide campaign of hyper nationalism to create the perception of an enemy within, so that whoever is dissenting is declared an anti-national. And all of this is happening at a time when the Modi government clearly, in the assessment of many of us, and I'm sure most of you present here, has not really been able to deliver on the economic front. And this is the time when they're trying to find ways to aggravate polarization in a bid to change the country's secular character and riding roughshod over democratic rights and civil liberties. In short, overall, I think the last 2 years have been marked by the worst communal polarization, not necessarily the worst communal violence, but the worst communal polarization after 1992, which includes the intimidation of minorities, dissenters, and public intellectuals. And all of this has happened largely because the BJP won an absolute majority, which seems to have given a license to its affiliates, so to speak, or to the RSS combine, to push its majoritarian program. And this has been polarized through a politics of fear, and also because the government refuses to take action against the perpetrators of this kind of politics. In other words, I think all of this has clearly enhanced, and one might say aggravated, the fears of religious minorities about living under a BJP regime enjoying a majority of its own. So in the event, I think what we have witnessed is the rise of vigilantism, social tensions involving a whole range of groups, not just Hindus and Muslims. We tend to focus only on the Hindu-Muslim division, but clearly, as again I think was being said in the previous session, the differences and conflicts between castes, between communities, and above all, also between classes, in short, between a whole range of groups. And this then brings me to the point that I really want to focus on, which is economic exclusion, which is an important dimension and consequence of the polarization of society between the privileged and the underprivileged, or between the privileged and the marginalized. The NDA government has dispensed with planning. It has abolished the Planning Commission. It has abolished the National Development Council. And yet it wants to jump on to the inclusion bandwagon. So its various policies and programs generally come with the tag inclusive. But despite all this talk of inclusion and so on, or sabka saath, the evidence, and I think there's a recent report done by the Center for Equity Studies, of which Harsh Mandar is the director, and this was a report that came out quite recently, I think just a couple of months ago, which provides very compelling evidence of the intensification of inequalities. inequalities and a lack of inclusion in terms of, let us say, the most important economic and social outcomes. And not surprisingly, those who suffer these exclusions tend to come from communities that are historically disadvantaged by gender, caste, religion, disability, and age, and they face multiple forms of exclusion. Now, in this context, if historically successive governments at the center, and I'm now talking about governments over the last, let's say, 3 or 4 decades, successive governments in the center, as also in the states, have unveiled a range of welfare initiatives, public distribution schemes to ensure nutritional security and subsidized food grains, targeted anti-poverty programs, unemployment benefits, public pensions, policy interventions in the area of health and education. But significantly, and this is really the point, significantly the agenda of the present government is not known for its concern for the poor or the dispossessed, or even debating a social welfare paradigm or an alternative social welfare paradigm. I think the present government doesn't really have a welfare policy beyond catchy slogans such as Swachh Bharat, Smart Cities, Startup India, Stand Up India, which is the most recent. But none of these, which are really essentially, as I said, catchy slogans, they don't really add up to a welfare policy or what policies would be effective in achieving the goals of social security. For example, the finance minister in his February 2016 budget speech spoke about social sector being the most important pillar of the economy, and he mentioned education, health and sanitation as key areas of social sector development. However, social sector was defined essentially in terms of universal subsidies, health insurance, dialysis schemes, and skill development. Now, in fact, the Ministry of Finance's own graphic for social sector seems to reduce social sector to these few items. Now, when the UPA government was routed in the 2014 Lok Sabha elections, it led many commentators to speculate about the future of the rights-based welfare acts, which were landmark acts that had been passed by the previous government. Now, of course, in the past 2 years, these rights-based programs have been the subject of much political contention, much political differences in the public arena. Now, at the end of 2 years, then, and in the context of this speculation that there will speculation about the future of these programs, I think at the end of the 2 years, this might be just a good time to assess the contours of BJP's welfare policy. Now, I think the trends of the last 2 years reveal cross-cutting tendencies. On the one hand, it is true that social sector schemes haven't been dispensed with, they haven't disappeared. On the other hand, I think this government is unmindful even of its legal obligations under these schemes, that is the rights-based schemes and so on, leave alone strengthening or adding to the welfare system. And I think the way in which it is being done is principally through under-provisioning of funds and cutting down financial outlays. That's been the hallmark of government, that is to say the BJP government's policy with regard to these programs. And this is evident from the budget allocation for 2015-16. And that is the major thrust for development is on infrastructure and housing projects in both rural and urban areas. Compared even to 2014-15, there has been a decline in the current budget, that is the 16-17 budget, in the share of GDP going as budgetary allocation for major social sector programs. In other words, the budgets of both 2015 and 16 of the 2 years of this government offer very little by way of a vision and also by way of expenditure for the development of social policy in India. Now, I think for the most part, government's attitude has been dismissive and derisive of the new welfare regimes put in place by the previous government. Nowhere is this more evident than in the government's ill treatment of Narega. The Prime Minister himself derided it as a monument to 60 years of failure of the previous government. Now, and the government has attempted, and the government had attempted several dilutions as soon as it took office, restricting it to the poorest districts, reducing the wage component, introducing greater rigidity in the type of works that could be taken up. As a result, instead of expanding, Narega is all set to contract despite the droughts and despite the enormous suffering of the rural poor in large parts of India's countryside. Now, in short, given the fact that people are battling drought, the scale of Narega works is clearly way below what is required, and wages often remain unpaid. Likewise, and I think this has not been commented upon as much, and that is that the National Food Security Act, which was actually passed only a few months before the UPA demitted office, if I'm not mistaken, it was passed probably in September 2013. And now we are nearing September 2016, 3 years since it was passed, and it has really not really been rolled out, and it hasn't really been implemented. And there, of course, and I won't really dwell on this, and that is in addition to this kind of dismissive attitude towards these programs, I think the biggest indication of the government's attitude was dismantling important safeguards in the Land Acquisition Act by means of ordinances to facilitate easy acquisition of agricultural land for industry. That was clearly a case of corporate capture. Now, of course, since then those ordinances were withdrawn, and therefore the Land Acquisition Act is still in place. But I think it remains to be seen. Whether some amendments would be introduced to that. Now, more recently, that is to say, this is before the present assembly elections, where the BJP has won one single state, and that is Assam. But in the wake of the Delhi and the Bihar defeat, I think this government did come under some pressure to backtrack on its right-wing, corporate-friendly policies by emphasizing welfare schemes to repair, to some extent to change its image as a pro-rich government. Now, and I'll come to that in a moment, it did introduce a couple of policies, but interestingly, the policies such as they are distinguished by two features. One, there is a distinct preference for the enactment of some sort of social policy from above. What is very striking, I suppose in contrast to the previous government, is that there is no civil society consultation or participation in the policy making process. This is hardly surprising given this government's distrust of civil society and NGOs. Consequently, obviously, the civil society space has shrunk, so to speak, and their ability to highlight the concerns of the marginalized sections with regard to impact of current policies and so on has obviously also shrunk. Second, and I find this very striking and has not been sufficiently noted, and that is that the social security schemes that have been introduced by this government in recent months, I think the government the social security schemes that the government proposes to implement demand investment not so much from the state, but from the proposed beneficiaries. Instead of the central government taking on the majority of the burden for helping the most disadvantaged groups, most of the new schemes pass on the responsibility to the people and communities. I think the latest is Startup or Stand Up India. This initiative is aimed at promoting entrepreneurship among scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and women by facilitating loans of the range of rupees 10 to 100 lakhs. Now, each branch of the scheduled commercial banks will facilitate these loans. And significantly, and you would recall when the Prime Minister inaugurated the scheme, the point that he made in this, in the context of all the criticism about the economy not generating jobs, and that there's a continuation of jobless growth, he made the point that he made the point that Dalit entrepreneurs will now generate jobs. So Dalit entrepreneurs are expected to generate jobs. Likewise, there are contributory social insurance schemes. That is another example of this approach. And the presumption here is that the poor should contribute to the betterment of their lives or to that of their families after death. Now, this kind of approach, as I said, it seems implausible in a country where you still have 300 million people who are very poor. So I think, in conclusion, then I would say that the upshot of the above-mentioned responses of the ruling dispensation is, in my view, an unmaking of the established policies of social development that has led to serious cutbacks on social sector public spending, to curbing of labor rights, to dilution of environmental protections, and, of course, what we have been discussing here, I presume, over the last day and a half, the curbing of dissent. There's a steady erosion, therefore, there's a steady erosion of the conception of the Indian state as we have understood it and as we have perceived it in some ways. So there is a steady erosion of the conception of the Indian state being a neutral arbiter of competing interests. Perhaps the neutrality of the state is overstated, in the past was overstated, and perhaps the neutrality of the state has always been a fig leaf, because the state, as we know, is not a neutral entity in class terms or caste terms. That said, and that accepted, the fact is, and I think we would do well, given the major transformations and changes that have taken place in Indian society, Indian economy, and the Indian polity, I think we would do well to recognize that the state is not a fixed entity. It's not a fixed thing. It can take diverse shapes and guises, and it can change with the change of regime. And I think, and here I'm making a distinction very deliberately between state and regime, and in fact suggesting that regime, which is a lower order concept, a change of regime, which is what happened in 2014, can certainly affect the organization and functioning of the state, which is what we have been witnessing over the past 2 years. Because of the change of regime, there seems to be a change in the orientation and functioning of the state as well, and the possibility, which is now evident, is that the state would not be a neutral arbiter. So whichever way we look at it, the state under the present dispensation is not a supra-social entity acting for society as a whole. Indeed, for many, I think the Indian state now appears to be brazenly biased, brazenly working for the rich and the middle classes, and sadly, quite sadly, siding with the majority religious community, much as I would like to believe otherwise. But the fact is that everything that we are seeing happening seems to suggest that there is there is a very, very evident and apparent majority bias, or a bias in favor of the majority community in the functioning of the state. Thank you.